you.
Hey, folks, welcome to the Unity Campfire. I am pleased to be here with Christine Brophy, who is a researcher at the University of Toronto. She did her doctoral thesis with her master's thesis with Jordan Peterson. She's currently working on her doctoral thesis. And she worked extensively on political correctness, which we will certainly be talking about in the next hour. I'm also here with Scott Barry Kaufman, who is a psychologist, podcaster, and science writer. His work focuses on human intelligence, potential, and creativity. He is a frequent contributor at Scientific American, and he hosts the podcast, The Psychology Podcast. So welcome to both of you.
So glad to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right. So you have some overlap in the area in which you work. And in fact, Scott, you've written a bit about that area of overlap. So I'm not sure exactly how to set the conversation in motion. Where do you think we should go first to orient people to the landscape of political psychology?
I have an idea for a good starting place, and let me know what you think about this. Maybe we could just outline what the big 5 traits are. I always find in my personality psychology class, always a good place to start. Before we dive into I know we're going to dive into antagonism, but maybe we could give a context of what the big 5 traits are.
Perfect.
What do you think?
All
Awesome.
right. Which one of you would like to start there? You want to do it, Scott?
Okay, I'll give a little bit of a primer. So you can view personality as a hierarchy. So at the very, very top of this hierarchy, there's actually 2 major dimensions of personality: stability and plasticity. So we each differ to the extent to which we feel like we don't have disruptive impulses, that we can focus in when there's threats, that we're conscientious, that we're assertive. And then there's also plasticity. We all differ to the extent to which we feel like we can adapt to change, and really grow and have plasticity. Right underneath that level of the hierarchy is our 5 traits. Extroversion, introversion is one continuum, and that's the extent to which we feel assertive and we have positive emotions or enthusiasm. And on the other end, introversion, much to the chagrin of a lot of introverts on the internet, by the way, introversion in the big 5 is just simply defined as the opposite of extroversion. And introverts don't want to be defined as the opposite of some other ideal, So we have to be very clear that it's not that one pole is the ideal pole necessarily, right? So we have introversion, extroversion, we have agreeableness, disagreeableness, we have conscientiousness. How are you disorganized and disorderly and ungritty would be one end. I don't know if ungritty is a word, but on the other end, you have perseverance and orderliness. We have neuroticism. How emotionally stable are you? How volatile are your emotions? Again, how much are your emotions prone to disruption from inner distractions as well as outer distractions? And then my favorite trait is openness to experience / intellect. It's a compound trait. All these are compound traits, which means they're a mix of things. But people who score high in openness, intellect tend to have intellectual curiosity, tend to be really open to aesthetics, sensations, their emotions. They have a full array of complex emotions. They like art, philosophy, and these sorts of things. So those are the 5 major dimensions, and I suspect we'll be focusing on some more than others today.
So what does it mean that those are the 5 major dimensions? Are these just somebody's guess, or have these been established as key in a way that other things don't rise to the same level of significance?
Usually shows up in adjectives all around the world, although it's been challenged recently the extent to which this really is cross-culturally replicated. And I think that is a fair criticism of the big 5, is that we tend to focus a lot on the weird people, white, or is it white? Is that it?
Western.
No, yeah, I always get it confused whether it's not Western or white, but Western, industrialized, et cetera, et cetera. Is the D democratic?
Something I would say that I've found whenever I've given talks about this, that people don't really, when you're asking this idea of like, what are these traits? Like, where are they coming about? Why are we considering them to be real? And that kind of leads into a conversation about factor analysis and what exactly is factor analysis, because that's how these traits were derived. And the kind of Cliff's Notes version of factor analysis is that you have a bunch of stuff that is like behaviors of people, their emotions, their the things that they like, things like that, and then you ask people how they rank on those things, whether or not they're very much like them or not at all like them, and then you see which of those kind of hang together, which of those things appear together in the world most often or in people most often. And when you go through that process, out pops these 5 factors or these 5 traits. And that's been what the power of the big 5 has been, as being rigorously tested or proven, as opposed to something like, what is it? Is it the MMPI that most people like to use? Yeah. So.
Or even like a lot of people love the Myers-Briggs.
Myers-Briggs, that's the one that I was
like,
like
yeah, when I go on dates, sometimes dates will be like, "What's your Myers-Briggs score?" And I'm like, "I'll tell you my big 5 score." It's like awkward. Yeah.
Okay, so these traits, these axes, are things that are robust cross-culturally to an extent, which pop out of an analysis. In other words, if we rate these things, they are predictive of other factors. In other words, if we look at somebody who has a similar rating on these 5 axes, that may be predictive of some other aspects of their interaction with the world. Is that fair?
In some cases, wildly predictive. I was really interested in the extent to which personality traits really matter when you put in regression analyses like environmental variables. And some of the research I looked at on the link between personality and well-being, for instance, it blew my mind how strong some of those correlations are, and some of those effects were actually stronger than all the demographic variables you could look at. So I think we actually underestimate the power of personality a lot in these kinds of discussions.
That's something that in our lab, that was kind of like a truism that was always said: whenever you're going to be running a study, make sure that you test personality and then IQ, because most of the time when you test personality and IQ, it knocks out demographic variables like completely. So
interesting. That means that it is a better predictor, that if you have the personality and IQ, that it swamps other things that might be correlated to those things. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
All else equal sort of thing.
All right. So I did want to go back. I'm rethinking what a weird country is, and I'm thinking the W is wealthy, and wealthy, industrialized, educated. R is going to be, damn. In any case,
I'm Googling it.
You're Googling it. All right. Fair enough.
I
didn't want to leave it hanging with wrong information. But anyway,
it is Western. You were right. You were right. You should trust your psychological knowledge more than I should trust my psychological knowledge, apparently. But no, Western, educated, industrialized, rich. Oh, okay. There is a rich and democratic.
All right.
You're right about that.
Yep. Cool. Okay, so why are we talking about these things? Let's just say we are watching something remarkable overtake the U.S., Canada, large parts of the West, and your work in this area, Christine, appears to be predictive of some fraction of what we are seeing. So do you want to lead us into what it is that you found about political psychology and personality types that seem to correlate with wokeness, for lack of a better term?
With wokeness, I guess. So, I mean, well, for political belief in general, I guess the biggest predictor is openness. If you're high in openness, that means that you're more likely to be a liberal. If you're low in openness, that means that you're likely to be a conservative. The next trait that we get is with conscientiousness, the aspect orderliness. If you're higher in orderliness, you're more likely to be a conservative. If you're low in orderliness, you're more likely to be a liberal. So one of the big things that came out of our lab, though, is that political belief isn't just a single dimension. So it's not just that if you don't just have conservatism on one end and liberalism on the other. And instead, it seems to be like maybe there's 2 dimensions, maybe 3. So on the one dimension, we get something like, on the conservative side, masculine independence. This is things like support for gun laws, people that are more agentic. They believe that they can go out and actually create their own future or do things in the world, or they have control over their environment, that they're able to create things. On the other side, you've got individual freedom, which is more like one of the traditional liberal values, which is the higher openness, low and orderliness. Then at the bottom two, we've got something like a religiosity sort of dimension. Sometimes if you go really to the extreme on that end, you get something like right-wing authoritarianism. And this is kind of in-group values, protection of your community, things like that. And then on the left-wing side, we get a left-wing authoritarianism. And this was kind of what popped out of my research. And on there, you get something like high levels of compassion, high levels of orderliness as well, and low levels of openness.
So what does this imply? I'm going to try to orient people, because I know what it is that you're getting at. And I know from experience that it can be, if you're not used to this kind of analysis, it can be hard to know what it means, right? It sounds like a lot of labels, but at some level, there's a process. And basically the point is, if we were to try to figure out how to understand what somebody's view of the world is going to be like, we can say, well, what's the biggest factor, right? Maybe it's what country you grew up in. What's the second most important factor? Maybe it's whether you're male or female, right? And the point is, you can go down that list and eventually you get to a set of criteria that have very little influence at all, right? If you start with the biggest ones, you get diminishing returns. And so what you're saying is that there are a small number of factors that do the heavy lifting of predicting somebody's orientation politically. And some of these things, I think viewers of mine will recognize, right? The idea that a liberal might be less orderly. I mean, I can certainly say, as a liberal, you nailed that one in my case. I am not orderly, but also openness. And so to the extent that we see an overlap in the concept of progressive and liberal, these both speak to a willingness to try something new. And frankly, progress is messy. So at some level, that's a non-accidental overlap, right? And conservatism has to do with retaining a kind of order, something that's been achieved that you want to protect from that messy process. All right. So what does this have to do with authoritarianism? What is authoritarianism, and what do these traits have to do with the way we encounter it?
Christine, I actually feel like there's a aspect of your research that that's really cool that I just want to highlight for a second. You found there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but you found something in common among both left-wing authoritarianism and right-wing authoritarianism is this moral disgust component. I think it might be worthy bringing in the moral disgust aspect into this. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so both of them share this kind of the underlying trait of interpersonal disgust, which the scale for that is things like if you shake somebody's hand, for example, that you feel compelled to like wash your hands afterwards, that there's some need to protect yourself from something outside of your control, or that there, and I mean, this is a sentiment that I think a lot of us are feeling right now, given we're in the COVID pandemic, which is something that I think is important to bring up about these kind of character clusters, or these traits, is that each of them, the clusters, are heuristics. You can think of this kind of like liberalism and conservatism as being like the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, where you've got them tied together by something like, well, what's supposed to be love is tying the two sides together, and both of them are in constant debate. And each of those systems, independent of the environment, is not inherently right or good, and it's only when they're tied together that you get them putting the body in an adaptive position to the current circumstances. So that's kind of like the best framing that I can think of, and that's been helpful for me to think of these traits, where the clusters of them are bringing together or pulling apart facts or highlighting certain facts as being relevant to a current circumstance so that you can develop a plan appropriately to address those. It also means that we'll get more nuanced policies by the interplay of these things, because each of these answers or strategies is not always going to be correct across the board.
All right. I'm still trying to find the way in so that people can see the elegance of the research and what it actually tells us about phenomena that we're all now encountering regularly. So authoritarianism, you've got two broad types. Is that correct, Christine?
Yeah, that's correct. Right-wing and left-wing authoritarianism.
And the distinction between them is what, most fundamentally?
Compassion. So the distinction between them is the level of compassion that somebody has. So on left-wing authoritarianism, you'll see that people tend to be higher in compassion. So their focus is on the bottom of a hierarchy, versus in right-wing authoritarianism, being low in compassion means that you're set to defend, I guess, the top of a hierarchy.
You know, conservatives score higher than liberals on politeness, though. There's two aspects of the agreeableness domain. So it's interesting. Some people have argued that conservatives and liberals are agreeable, but just in different ways. Mm-hmm. I think Colin DeYoung and colleagues have argued that. So it's, you know, I think you can't just say that like one or the other is more good. You know, some people kind of say that, you know, they're good people, you know, you're a better person because you score higher in compassion, you know, they kind of manifest in different ways.
So I have said just intuitively, as somebody who has faced a certain amount of this authoritarianism, that it feels like people's compassion is being weaponized against them, that people who want to see a fairer, more decent world find themselves doing the bidding of authoritarians because they're told that that there is an aggrieved and injured party that is in need of protection. Is there anything to this?
You know,
is people's compassion being weaponized against them to manipulate them into doing things?
Well, there is some recent research showing that it's actually called virtuous victimhood signaling. That's like the technical term in the scientific literature, is correlated with the dark triad personality traits, suggesting there are certainly those who score high in maybe not actual genuine compassion. It's hard to tease these things out, like where it's coming from sometimes, like what personality structure within the person is this coming from. But there is that research suggesting that those who actually score, they score low in compassion, they score high in the dark triad traits, use and weaponize victimhood as a way to gain power. But obviously not everyone who expresses victimhood is doing that and scores high in the dark triad traits. But this research suggests there is like a certain population, you know, from an individual differences perspective, that do that. And I almost wonder to the extent to which what you see sometimes, Bret, is not necessarily people who are coming from a genuine place of compassion. Those people do exist for sure, but I wonder sometimes if what you're seeing are people who are coming from a different place. And it's hard to tease these things apart sometimes.
Well, I think that's exactly what I'm wondering about, is that a small number of bad actors that are willing to claim victim status cause a large number of people who are well-intentioned but not paying close attention to details to act. And so I see, mobs of people who individually I don't think are aware even of what they are doing or who they are challenging. They just feel like they're doing the right thing. They're protecting someone who needs it, and that this is, in fact, a big part of the story of this moment. I've heard Jordan Peterson, in fact, talk a little bit about the fact that what he says is your infant is always right? You don't question, if your infant is crying out, you don't question what your infant is saying, whether they're being manipulative. They have a need, and it's right by definition, and that the same instinct towards maternal protection seems to be activated inappropriately in these modern claims of victimhood.
I think this is this exact same, but it's the same phenomena again of like trying to use a hammer to solve every single problem. And if you're always going at everybody with pure compassion, coupled with the higher openness, which means that you're very good at developing explanations as to why something might be true based on circumstance. So somebody's crying out for help, and you really want to help them because you're high in compassion. And then you're very good at pointing out all the environmental variables that could potentially be causing their suffering. That's kind of, it can, if you're only applying a hammer to absolutely everything, doing that for everything, it can lead to this kind of authoritarian sentiment sort of being justified in those instances.
Yeah, and oxytocin is so linked to that motherhood response to your child, but that same neurochemical oxytocin is actually really, I think the best descriptor for it is it's the in-group love hormone. Some people call it the cuddle hormone, but researchers looked deeper into that neurotransmitter and found out that actually it's only the cuddle hormone if you perceive the person as within your in-group and sharing the same values and political beliefs. If they don't, it's actually the opposite of cuddling. You want to protect everyone in your in-group against that person.
Well, if you think about it, those are the same thing, right? The willingness to defend one's child to the death if need be, right? That ultimate demonstration of love is the root of the ferociousness against others that are a threat, right? And so this in-group, out-group dynamic, unfortunately, is deeply written into the human code. And in some sense, it should be no surprise that it is modulated by the very same hormone, because in effect, to love the in-group is to love it against its enemies.
That's right.
It's
protection. Yeah.
There's a really great study that was done about with oxytocin, and it starts off where they present individuals with stories about people, and they develop these preconceived judgments of them, or in there it says like whether or not a person is good or bad. And once you've already made that judgment of the goodness or badness of somebody, that oxytocin then made it so that it didn't matter if you presented further information about the other individual that disproved the initial hypothesis or statement of their goodness or badness. So bad individual, that they did all these good deeds. You would just ignore all of that information because they were bad and you already made that decision. And that's oxytocin basically is really helpful in that regard. You will process information more deeply for an in-group. You'll remember the positive details about individuals for your in-group thanks to oxytocin. Your evaluations of them will be higher. You'll want to give them more, like resources. You'll allocate resources more to them than to an out-group, and that's all with oxytocin.
Yeah, and you even are more willing to lie. Mm-hmm. Like there's some interesting research showing that you're more willing to lie and justify the lying if your oxytocin is activated.
So this does remind me an awful lot of the political landscape, where it seems that there is a breed of human that is incapable basically, if Trump does something, it is by definition evil. It almost doesn't matter what it is. And then you see the mirror image of this on the other side. And the worst way to get through this moment seems to be to try to evaluate things a la carte on their merits, because then both sides just agree that you're an idiot. Yeah. You haven't noticed this? I must be living on a different planet, because on my planet, everybody seems to suffer from either Trump derangement syndrome, either that, or they seem to think that he's the Messiah and that the rest of us are missing out, and there's just no room for any middle ground.
Oh, it's so true. I know coming out of, I don't know, like, well, for the most recent debate, which to me was the most, it was shocking. I expected that what would have come out of that debate was everybody saying, okay, hold on, that was horrible. And I don't know if you've ever, like, if you've gone, after watching that debate, I went back and I watched prior debates from different candidates, because I was trying to figure out what the heck happened. Where did we go wrong? What was that point in time where things just took a turn for the worse? And maybe this is like the scientific mindset where you want to be able to pinpoint the cause so that you can be like, all right, if only we just knocked out social media, then everybody would be fixed and like we would all be a bunch of good humans again. But one of the most shocking things that you come across when you go back and you watch those debates is that there wasn't a clear slide down. And in fact, if you were to watch Obama debating Romney, it's like it was an incredible debate. All the debates that they had, because they were individuals who were debating one another, allowing each other to be humans, and instead of labeling them as evil in different ways, telling the other one to shut up, or going and attacking their history. Instead, they were just having a debate about their cause and effect landscape, their maps that they had. So whether or not a particular plan of action that you had, what were the good effects it was going to have and the negative ones, and what are the relative value of those. But you were leaving room for the individual to be a human and walk away from that still being somebody who's just trying to do their best, as opposed to labeling them as evil. And if you go back through the history of all of these debates, you'll see that there's varying degrees to which we manage to do that as in a political society, where some candidates are much better at that. They won't give into temptation that the reporters have of like prompting them of like, oh, well, this mudslinging thing happened. When you watch Clinton's debate with Bush, the audience actually calls them out and says, guys, what are you doing on the why are you mudslinging and leading up to this debate? And like, you are better than this and we are better than this. I was expecting to hear that after the Trump debate, the most recent one with Biden, and instead people walked away being like, oh, well, let's justify his bad behavior because that guy's a big bully and he's evil, and of course that's what he said, because man, like nothing else could possibly happen except for that. And that to me was it was shocking.
I feel like we got exactly what we ordered, and then everybody looked at it and they were like, who ordered this? Yeah. It was like, you did, right? You elected the guy from The Apprentice, and then as a challenge to him, you nominated an empty suit. It's like, okay, did you want a good debate? Because I know how you get there, and it isn't this way. What you need is higher quality candidates, which means you have to hold your damn parties to account. And it's like everybody's just so mystified that the debate wasn't good. But I mean, you could have seen that coming, miles away.
Yeah.
I would, so part of this, for me at least, like when I was thinking about what exactly caused all this and where did we go wrong, it made me realize too that we could put in, we have this desire to kind of fix the system, to tweak things to make it better. If only we had like better candidates, but ultimately we're all a bunch of people who are making decisions on a daily basis, and either of those candidates, like Trump or Biden, they could make a decision at any moment towards good behavior versus bad behavior, and it's just like they can make that decision. The reporters who are reporting afterwards, who are like digging into Trump's records just to humiliate him, things like that. It's just we're a bunch of people right now who are not treating each other as humans, and this is what's coming from it.
Well, is Trump human really though?
Yes.
Okay.
He's
Glad you guys.
he's tragically human.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Oh, that's a good way of putting it. Actually, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so I mean, I think there's something to what you're saying, Christine, and I think what I see is there's this process that happens before people go to war or commit genocide, and it involves dehumanizing the target, right? It involves analogizing the target to vermin, to declaring them subhuman, to doing, you do all these things in advance of attacking someone. And we are now doing it in the US with each other, right? We are now portraying each other as not deserving of human compassion, which causes the compassion to get turned off, and it frees people to engage in absolutely obnoxious behavior towards each other, and it's mirrored in our political dynamic. And it is a switch, right? The problem is it's hard to flip it back. Once you've dehumanized somebody and then you've said terrible things about them, it's hard to be nuanced again because you feel like it's a betrayal of what you already stated. And so for those of us in the US who have been trying to slow this march into, I don't know, disintegration, civil war, whatever it is, it's a very frustrating process because it's like, it's very easy to shut down the compassion, very hard to boot it back up. And so it's like a sea of people who, the toggle switch is flipped the wrong way and there's a spring holding it down. Now, I don't know, is there any work on what flips the compassion back on? Do we know?
I mean, I can tell you a story from personal experience that I've had most recently that was it was eye-opening to me. So one of the things that I've run into, I guess, from when I've been presenting this research along the way is that as long as while presenting it, you go in, you present a bunch of stuff about individual differences with the hope that by highlighting the way in which people are different, that people would just come to this kumbaya kind of higher understanding that that we're all just like limited beings, that we have certain strategies or things that work in certain circumstances, but ultimately we're out for the better, and that people will just, when you say this is why we're all different but come together for some greater good, that people will just do that. And but unfortunately, whenever I would go in to present on this stuff, what would pop out of it is people would just be taking the bits and pieces of the research that justified their own beliefs and then using it as ammo against the other side. So if you dig into the psychology research about political differences and personality, you see this kind of back and forth between the sides trying to grab for intelligence to say which side is more intelligent than the other so that they can like have the intelligent people on their side. The other one is which ones are mentally unstable. So we'll see a lot of stuff for like the mental health disorders, or which ones had bad parenting. All these things that we're just trying to say are the reasons why they're different from us is because they're acting out of fear, whereas us, the higher beings, we're acting out of rationality and, goodness. So unfortunately, by just presenting the research, it doesn't bring about compassion. Go figure. Reason doesn't bring about compassion for the other side. We know this, but when I was, by giving somebody a framework to kind of, or almost like permission to say, oh yes, people can be complicated and you can have good and bad within the same person. I did this with some of my friends when we were looking back through the debates. And I was so sad when Trump came out about COVID, the fact that he had contracted it, and very good people, some of the best people that I know who are so good in the community, were saying things like, haha, like now it's got him, like this is, and I hope that the people around him also get COVID and things like that. And it was, I knew that they didn't believe that. I knew that this was just something that they were saying because, again, in-group stuff, like approval from those around you, and it's so hardwired into us right now. But when you go back and you look at the Bates and you see that, and showing them these things, that this is not that we are human, and that this is not some unique circumstance that has like thrown us off guard, that these are people who are making decisions. The following day after that, there was like a shift in some of my friends that I saw, and it was that they started to identify like, oh, that was bad when this person did this. Like there was a couple times where Bush, the younger one, was kind of strutting his stuff as opposed to responding honestly, and it was like, oh, that's not good, this is good. And the news article came out today about Trump not wearing a mask in the helicopter ride we saw, and the response to that was, this was the shift that happened that was a little bit more compassion showing. They said, you know, it's too bad that this was what the news article was that came out, because the real hero of that story is the helicopter driver who's taking a family or person with COVID. And initially, my friend called taking this idiot with COVID, and then they actually self-edited and they said, like, no, actually, I shouldn't be calling him an idiot, taking this person with COVID back to the White House. So that's been my experience. I don't know if in there's an answer as to how to draw out compassion, but it's not with reason, that's for sure.
You know, I wrote a tweet once, or something like, I'm gonna butcher re-quoting myself right now, but it was something like, as long as you don't trigger someone's threaten their political identity and their gender, sexual identity, and I went down a long list of things. I said even favorite Pokemon character. Then people actually tend to be pretty kind and nice to each other. And you know, the point there is that we have so many ego mechanisms, like defense mechanisms, that are up right now, and one could say rightly so. From a lot of people don't feel like they are being treated as though they're fully human, so therefore they think to themselves, why should I treat others as though they're fully human, especially those who I perceive as not treating me as fully human? And so I think a big part of that question is exactly what Christine said as well, is having this complex view of each other. But also the latest social science of intergroup reconciliation shows the only way forward is when everyone acknowledges that the other person matters, that a group matters, and that and people really just at the end of the day want to feel like they're seen and that they're heard and that they matter. We all want to feel that way. That's a basic need. And instead of this victimhood Olympics, we actually recognize that we all have that basic need. Your basic need for that doesn't necessarily, for lack of a better word, trump everyone else's basic need for that. And so some of my thoughts on that.
So let me ask you something. I've been wrestling. Pieces of this go back several years for me, but I think it's beginning to gel. I'm wondering about the psychology of the moment and whether or not what we're really seeing is that for some fraction of the population, maybe especially people who are young enough that the internet has been a dominant feature of their development, that they take the internet to have a kind of primacy over the outside world. And if one makes that, I would claim it is just a simple error, that in the end, the outside world will outlast the online world. There's nothing that you can't rewrite the rules in the online world and expect the outside world to play along. In other words, if I can give an example, the idea that all a man has to do to become a woman is to declare himself a woman is almost true in an online environment, right? If you are willing to portray yourself as female and you feel better about doing so, then in a sense, in an internet discussion, maybe the right rule is, look, if you say you're a woman, then you are, and we'll treat you that way, and that's the decent thing to do. And then if you try to export that rule into the real world, all hell breaks loose, right? Because now you're interfering with biology classes and medicine and all kinds of places where it isn't as simple as I feel like a woman, therefore I am one, right? So my question is, psychologically speaking, is it is it reasonable to imagine that what is taking place is we are having a disagreement about whether the real world trumps the online world or the online world trumps the real world? Are some of these claims about what's true really a negotiation for the desired rules of the online world?
What a great question. Christine, I don't know how much you spend online. Are you on Twitter much, to the extent that Bret and I are in the muck?
No, not at all. I know my friends are quite upset about that on an ongoing basis, but I don't have the patience, unfortunately, for a lot of social media. Yeah.
So, what kind of mental disorder is it that keeps you off Twitter? And is it possible that I could catch it at this late age?
That's funny.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's possible. I do wonder if it's just simply a driver of insanity. But I still want to know if there's anything to this idea. Are these authoritarians negotiating for rules as if when you go out into the world, right? Most people, when they go out into the world, they are interacting with relatively generic shops, restaurants. It's not an endeavor that has an opportunity to make headway, to achieve something, right? It's just the world, and it's uninteresting most of the time. Online, you can have big successes, right? You can say something clever, it can go viral, it can get lots of likes, you can declare somebody awful and a pile-on can ensue, and that can be very invigorating, I would imagine, right? So I guess the comparison between these two worlds suggests to me that maybe people are mistaking one as the important one when actually it's really the trivial, ephemeral one.
I think, well, I mean, just the kind of juxtaposition that you made there, the difference between the online world versus the external world is that, like, the feedback that you're receiving is very clear as opposed to the ambiguity that you get out in the real world. And that means that suddenly you're not able to deal with the uncertainty that comes. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, I guess, is listening to some of the comments that are being made by the leaders of the Democratic versus the Conservative Party, that they become almost like these caricatures, and you can just imagine, or you see the group of people that are around them that are telling them, oh, well, you should be saying this in order to essentially get these number of likes or this amount of support. This will poll well. And you see them using strategies that have worked in the past. And this is all based on these kind of like going off of external feedback mechanisms that you get online, which, is great in the moment because it quells the anxiety because you're operating on past certainty. But unfortunately, that means that nobody's really developing an internal moral compass of what's right and wrong because they're not having to face the ambiguity that we do out in the real world, which like feedback of like, I don't know, should I be adjusting my behavior to this? Maybe, maybe not. And it's only from many iterations that you start to pay attention to your own soul and be like, okay, this is the right way to go about things. And instead we're just being stuck in these artificial worlds where the feedback is very clear and we never have to start making judgment calls for ourselves.
I'm not convinced that there's such a discrepancy that Bret's seeing between the real world and online media. My own perception is that those who are activists in the real world for their causes related, maybe it's trans rights, or it's whatever the sexual identity is, or whatever the activism causes, they tend to say similar things online, that they go to rallies and they say, and that they are in the academia environment. And I mean, I was at Barnard College and I saw it. It's not like Barnard College was online, right? I mean, it pervaded everything. Everyone was talking about social justice and rights for trans people, rights for women's rights, etc. So I guess I'm not 100% convinced that there is such a stark distinction as you're seeing, Bret.
Well, I agree, although maybe we can upgrade the model a little bit. There's something about these other environments that's abstract also. So if let's say we have an online chat environment. And it's very important, as I think it should be very important, that everybody is equal there, right? That nobody faces a disadvantage based on demography. Okay, great. Now we've got a college. Well, we can make the same rule, right? And we could actually, in a limited way, engage in some kind of shuffling of this and that in order to bring about the kind of equality that we established perfectly online, right? And then you get around to, the houses people go home to on Thanksgiving. And the point is, well, if we want that same equality, then what we have to do is transfer enough wealth to make it happen. And suddenly you're, digging up civilization on the basis of a rather naive view of how things work, because you exported the belief system from an environment that is by its nature simplified, right? You have the sense, well, why can't we just make the world like that? And the answer is, well, actually, you would have to know how the world functions before you understood what you can and can't do in the world and what the consequences of your actions are likely to actually be, right? So I feel that many of us are seeing ourselves dragged towards the dissolution of a civilization on which we are dependent on the basis of claims that we already know are false, and helpless to do anything about it because a large number of people are convinced that if we just want it bad enough, it can happen.
Yeah, and there are certain narratives that, if they're put forward, are rewarded on social media and amplified. And if you even the slightest critique of that narrative based on evidence, you get shunned, and you can get canceled, I suppose, in a lot of ways. So I think social media does reward certain things. Another thing I've noticed, and I don't know if we want to go here yet, but I've been studying a trait called vulnerable narcissism for 10 years or so. And I have been making the case that online media rewards vulnerable narcissism much more than it would in the real world, for instance. That there's this idea that if you have certain forms of suffering that are the in forms of suffering, it's like they're the popular ones that everyone's talking about, then you can get a lot of social status. You can by saying as many of these vulnerabilities as possible, whereas maybe another subset that are not as social status oriented, getting you social status. So I have seen the rise in the rewarding of vulnerable narcissism.
Vulnerable narcissism. All right, that's a new one on me.
Yeah. Christine, you know about that construct, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. It's a really neat one, and I've been really exploring that deeply. It's not so grandiose narcissism is where you feel like you're entitled to special privileges because you think you're great. Vulnerable narcissism is you feel like you're entitled to special privileges because you've suffered in the past. So the entitlement is the thread that weaves among both grandiose and vulnerable, but vulnerable narcissism is more tied to neuroticism domain than extroversion.
Yeah, the relevance to the breakdown of civilization that we are seeing is obviously quite clear. So it's a robust, measurable trait?
Oh, yeah. Very robust, and I don't think gets enough attention, and might actually write a book on this topic. I think that it's just, I see it everywhere. And, here are some key characteristics of vulnerable narcissism. Hostile attribution bias. Big one, which you see in the borderline personality literature as well. But borderline has a very strong correlation with vulnerable narcissism. So you just immediately see malevolent intentions and ambiguous stimuli. So that would be a really big one. You just immediately assume that person didn't smile at me because they're racist. As opposed to waiting for them actually to be racist, and saying you're racist. You get way ahead of the game, and say, oh, it's neutral facial expression. You must be racist, right? So malevolent. So that's a big one. Distrust, hostility, cynicism, but also grandiosity and this kind of entitlement. And it's an interesting juxtaposition because on the one hand you feel low self-esteem, but on the other hand you feel entitlement. So someone described a comedian, Gerard Garago, or I'm butchering his name, but anyway, he's a comedian. He once said, "I often feel like I'm a piece of shit at the center of the universe." And I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling, but that feeling is very much tied to this vulnerable narcissism paradox.
Well, I have to say, I have a sneaking suspicion that we have done so much to these youngest generations that has not served them, that has hobbled them and made them incapable of navigating. That, obviously narcissism is a personality disorder, but the sense of being incapable and therefore entitled does not strike me as entirely wrong. Actually, these people were owed tools that would make them powerful and capable, and instead they were hobbled. And in some sense, I wonder how much of the anger that we see is a recognition by people that they're just simply not equipped to navigate, and therefore they're demanding to be taken care of.
Well, I mean, so this kind of, for me, I think that every generation faces that. Like the moment that you leave your family environment, that you leave the environment in which you've developed a bunch of ways of going about things that work, and inevitably your parents are flawed and they've left a big hole in terms of your understanding, and you're going out into the world kind of hobbled by them. That's why we all have horror stories about the way how we were raised. And then you go into the real world, and suddenly you're dealing with more complexity, with people with different opinions, different ways that you need to go about things. And you have to make a decision to either discard the parts of you that aren't working and kind of and learn new ones, or else you end up suffering for the rest of your life. And it's every generation has faced that same problem. It's just that by looking for a reason as to why this generation is like this, it's that we're trying to take the responsibility off their shoulders to grapple with the same problem that every single other generation has had to grapple with.
I'm not sure that there isn't a trajectory. In other words, I think that some aspect of this covers each generation, but if you'll permit me to be slightly nasty, one of the reasons that the baby boomer generation is so insufferable is that they actually had high capacity and a world in which that high capacity meant that being industrious worked. And I've had numerous conversations with boomers about the fact that the generations that came after them didn't face a world where what they did would necessarily have functioned. And it's a hard point to make, because we all think that the world that we inhabit is the world, right? We don't realize it's changing. And so, the degree to which younger generations have been overdiagnosed and medicated, and the tools that we have given them in school have been ever less appropriate to the world that they then have to find work in, that does change things. So it's possible that this generation is facing the same thing that their elders did. It's also possible they're facing a worse situation, and that it's something we need to grapple with.
I also think some of this is kind of built into human nature, a certain tendency. Some research has found that, regardless of who you are, you can experimentally manipulate entitlement, the feeling of entitlement in the laboratory, depending on how you can make people feel wronged for something. And you can do this in a social psychology experiment. It doesn't matter what your race is, what your ethnicity, gender. We all can kind of fall prey to this general tendency that if we feel like we've been wronged in our lives, we feel greater like it's okay to take more things because I deserve it, or I'm most entitled to it. And I think that overcoming that bias is can be tough, but I think that the better way to heal oneself and to move forward with greater positive connections with others and life satisfaction is to eventually have this engagement with the world and good and assuming good intentions unless proven otherwise, and just kind of changing your whole mindset about what's central to your identity. Is the suffering central to your identity, or this post-traumatic growth central to your identity? And that's a whole other field in psychology, post-traumatic growth, showing a lot of people are able to grow from their traumas and find greater meaning and creativity, and not stay in that mental space their whole lives of victimhood as the main thing they lead with.
So then would you say that it's something that's surrounding, perhaps, that we haven't allowed people to fail, or like this generation to fail, like
Yeah.
that it's not trusting them to be able to be strong enough to recover from their failure and to learn from it, and instead we're removing that that ability from them. And I guess you also see this a little bit in the political sphere too, where rather than laying out your argument as to this is the policy that I would like that we can do, and these are the things that could potentially go wrong with it, but this is the good that it's going to do, and being honest about the effects of the things that you're suggesting, because you trust the population to be able to take that information and navigate accordingly, rather than just withholding it and saying that what you're doing is completely virtuous and all good just so that you can trick people, or you think that you can trick people in a way just to getting what you want and what you think is right or morally superior?
A lot of really good questions there, and I actually really liked something that Bret said in a prior Campfire, which might be relevant here. I like multiple things he said in the past, but this one in particular, which is that we don't strike a good balance in recognizing the importance of responsibility and the importance of taking care of people who are suffering. And the right and the left tends to focus more exclusively on one or the other, especially when you get to the extreme right or left. Right. And I'm right on board with this. When Bret said this, I was like, yeah, Bret, I'm right on board with this. Is that to really have a nuanced discussion about this requires talking about the right balance to strike in one's life so that an individual can live a fulfilling and self-actualized life. And a big part of that is taking a certain sense of responsibility and not not having projection for all of the problems that you may have legitimately had. I'm not trying to take away from someone's real victimhood or real suffering in the past, but the question is, how do you perceive, what's your worldview? How do you perceive new interactions and your failures? Do all of your failures, it's because when I was in 5th grade, I was bullied. That explains why at age 40 I failed in this endeavor. Do you want to live your whole life like that? Or do you want to start to be an agent, in your life and feel like you're the author of your life story?
Yeah, it's a question. And of course, the thing that haunts the discussion from my perspective is development. The problem is that I think that there is kind of a best approach to life, and none of us are achieving it. But nonetheless, there's a certain degree of robustness that one wants to bring into the world, because you're just simply hobbled if you don't have it. And the problem is that the ability to generate those characteristics that do leave people capable of navigating and fulfilled and generative, the ability to generate those things disappears over time. That really they have to be reinforced fairly early in order for those circuits to develop. And so our errors become, effectively permanent psychological disabilities. So I'm not sure what to do about that. I mean, for future generations, we could stop screwing up. That would be a good start. But I'm not sure what we do for people who have been, led to imagine that they're entitled not to suffer, and therefore when they do suffer, it's crippling, right? Fact is, there's a certain amount of suffering, and you need to be able to endure it.
Yeah.
So that's actually kind of brilliant. I've never heard that expression before, but I'm going to definitely use that in the future. Feeling as though you're entitled not to suffer. When you put it that way, Bret, you really clearly see how silly that is. Because to be human is to suffer. To have human existence is to is for things not always to go the way that you planned or the way that you wanted, and to be able to tightly control the world. And we can't all be monks and go and spend our entire lives on a mountain and just stay in our own heads our entire lives, right? We don't all have that privilege. So yeah, that's a very interesting thing. The entitlement to not to suffer ever. Yeah.
Right. I mean, in fact, A, I don't think the monks aren't suffering. And B, if you didn't suffer, I think it would screw you up so badly. Yeah. You just wouldn't know what to think, right? Yeah. You have to suffer. It's natural. And the understanding that that's what it is, that it's temporary, that the goal of the exercise is, if you are suffering, to find your way out, right? That's the skill. That's the life skill. And, you know, God damn us for not teaching people that, right? You're going to suffer. Here's what you do.
I wonder if that's a lesson that you have to start teaching people more, because I mean, it's an inevitable byproduct of our society that as we're getting better and we're removing suffering, that you got to start reminding people, oh, by the way, this is the norm, so that they're not just blown over the moment that they're, well, like in their 30s or something, and it takes that long before they've kind of developed this thick skin resilience to it, or used to like bouncing back with small failures and small amounts of suffering. So they can manage the larger things that are inevitably going to come their way as they age.
Well, I mean, and the online world just makes it so difficult to make the proper point, right? If the kids were playing out in the street the way they used to when I was a kid, right? They fall. They hurt themselves. They bleed in the street. You witness it, and then it happens to you, and you have some model as to what to do about it. If your world is the online world, though, and you perfect your presentation to the world so that it looks like you're happier than you are, because what you do is you emphasize your successes. And so that's what people see. And then, you know, even worse, I don't know what app it is that puts filters on people that makes them look, you know, prettier and more handsome than they actually are. But I know that's happening now.
I'm using one right now.
Wonderful. It's working beautifully. But the thing is that this just gives a completely distorted sense to those who are in your social circle about what life is, because they know that they are suffering. They feel it personally, and they don't get the sense that you are, because you look like you aren't.
Oh, yeah.
It's a really good point. And being in academia, I saw this sort of attitude of like, well, if someone is suffering, who are we going to fight? You know, that's the first thing, is what group, who's at fault, you know, outside of myself. And you know, I taught a course, I created a course, The Science of Living Well, on positive psychology, and I would get some pushback from some of the students. Well, how could we even begin to talk about the right mindsets for healthy psychological development when there are people starving, when there are people suffering? And it boggled my mind that we've set up this false dichotomy in our school systems with students. We really are kind of indoctrinating students to believe in this false dichotomy, that you have to wait your entire life fighting something that'll never be perfect before you can even begin to have inner peace, before you can even begin to take some sense of responsibility for what you can control. And it boggled my mind that I would get pushback on that. People would literally say to me, you shouldn't even be teaching this course, Scott. We can't even, this course is, you know, we can't even begin to learn these kinds of principles until we've fought the patriarchy, for instance, you know?
Oh, it's such a terrible model for priorities, right?
Yeah.
Here's the one thing I can guarantee you is it ain't going to be perfect while we're here. So we damn well be able to work under imperfect conditions. You know,
Yeah.
If you can't make progress under those conditions, then it's hopeless.
Yeah.
I think that's, I mean, something else that probably comes from all this. It's not just perfection in terms of with social approval, but also the path to achievement. That's something else that's kind of been lost, where we've lost sight of the fact of how much stumbling goes along just to reach the end point, and that you end up again with this like overpowering ideal that you're holding in your mind that just will like it stops you from even bothering to try. And so, yeah, it's not just with social approval, but also the path to achievement. Again, these external feedback mechanisms that we're focusing so much on that external feedback. Yeah.
Well, and maybe the other way to see that is that online achievement, you know, the tweet that goes viral or whatever it is easy and immediate. and it robs us of the sense of how much failure actually goes into success. And I used to see this when Heather and I taught our students. We used to assign a project called Learn a Skill. And the point was, it didn't really matter what the skill was, but it had to be objective. It had to be a skill where you knew when you failed and you knew when you'd succeeded without anybody telling you, right? Like juggling, right? You know when you're juggling successful and you know when you failed, right? So the point was to train them to teach themselves to do something, right? And the problem was sometimes, very frequently, in fact, students would set out a goal, sounded like something that they could do, and then they would get very frustrated at how hard it was. But the fact is, it wasn't like they were actually struggling more than you would expect. It's just that the thing that they had set their sights on was harder than they realized things actually were. And, somehow, I think we just, among the many things that we need to do to put things right again, is to restore a reasonable sense of how difficult things are, how messy progress actually is, how slow it is. And without that, the demand to fix everything perfectly this instant is going to destroy us.
Yeah, I completely agree. And add to that how messy humans are. Yeah, that's a huge one to add to this. Imagine if we all treated others as though, what we know about ourselves, which is that we're not these morally superior beings. Researchers have looked into this, by the way, and they have yet to find a perfectly morally superior human. There's actually a really interesting study, "Is Anyone Perfectly Virtuous?" is the title of this scientific paper. And they looked and they found that we're just talking about density distributions, meaning that people who tend to be more virtuous tend to be more the 4 and 5s on a Likert scale during the course of their day, but they sneak in the 1s and 2s. I mean, don't tell me the Dalai Lama never, sneaks in a little chocolate every now, a little, he gets a little naughty. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfectly virtuous human, and science certainly hasn't found it.
Yeah. The difference between what we portray and what's actually real is major. And unfortunately, I think the way we're interacting is hiding it from people. They think actually, it's them and everybody else is somehow cleaner.
I'm reminded when you were just saying that thing about the juggling, about learning to juggle. Some of the work that I've done with high school students. So when Jordan first set out doing the self-authoring program, and specifically the future authoring program, it was goal setting based. So it's purely like you set goals. And when he was running it on populations, there was kind of like this limit that you hit where this would work. And that was sort of when people went into university, we could just do goal setting. But prior to that, it wasn't working. And that was kind of the task that I took on, was trying to figure out how do we get a similar type of intervention to help teenagers and people in middle school as well, and high school. So first I started off, I was like, well, we'll just try goal setting and we'll like change up the wording a little bit, use a little bit more relatable examples, and maybe that will help out. And tried it, that failed. It was not good. And instead I had to include this element of problem solving and a focus on the fact that you're going to set an ideal and you're going to set an aim, and it's going to be wrong. And that what you need to focus in on is the fact, like, know that it's going to be wrong. And then you're going to be going through this process of iterative, just trial and error, and treating it as a game of like, what do I need to, how do I make this work for me, given my own limitations, to take steps forward? And my path is going to look very different from someone else's. But that entire idea where you can't just do goal setting, it's not just about setting an ideal there. It's about, it's the path to get there. I mean, we've all heard that before.
Well, I think we've all heard it, but to me, I do a lot of tinkering. And the idea, I don't think most people know how to prototype something. And they don't know. So a prototype is often extremely clunky, if it works at all, right? But what it does is it teaches you what you didn't know about, you sit down, you design the thing on paper maybe, then you make it, and then you realize all the reasons it can't be the way you thought it could be, and then you make the next one. And the point is, that process, including your junky first prototype that barely functioned at all, that is success. Right. And so you have to, if you look at that junky first prototype and you feel like, Well, that sucks. Nobody would want that, right? That's self-defeating. If you look at it and you say, this is going to work. I know now what I didn't know before, and you move ahead, you can get there. But somehow, in all of the schooling that I went through, nobody ever taught me that. I never encountered it, right? That was something discovered in my free time, taking stuff apart and making things. And so how is it that that's not, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in other people's schooling, that was a lesson that came up, but I mean, is that taught somewhere?
Coding.
I guess that would be
in computer, but it wasn't something that I learned from computer science in the university. It was something that I learned from coding courses outside of the university, where the sprint methodology that came out of Google, just to get something to market as fast as possible, or to an audience as fast as possible, because you don't know the things that you don't know, and just to be able to test it, the smallest version of it that will take the least amount of your time to move forward. And that's something that that I tried to work when I was working with high school students, to get them with the same idea when they're trying to figure out their direction that they want to go in their future is, you fail early, fail often, but you want to put out a prototype of what your life is going to be as fast as possible in the real world to test it, because you don't know anything about yourself. You don't know who you are or what you want to do. So getting out there as fast as possible to fail is one of the biggest and best lessons I think that people can learn right now.
Yes, I'm fond of this aphorism. Good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from bad judgment. But there's a certain, the wisdom about how to do something or how to feel about it comes from suffering. And I don't know. I feel we're sort of generally failing to convey that message.
Or not just suffering, but the opposite of experiential avoidance, whatever that may be. It's not always suffering, but that's the whole core principle of the acceptance commitment therapy approach that I'm a big fan of. Yeah.
So could you spell that out?
Yeah, it's a psychotherapy approach that has gained a lot of research attention in recent years, and the central concept is psychological flexibility, which is the opposite of experiential avoidance. And experiential avoidance is this construct in psychology where it's just what it sounds like. You avoid the slightest thing that might cause you to feel uncomfortable emotions in any way, and that is just correlated with lots of negative outcomes in life. But if you can have more of a psychologically flexible life where you act based on your values, regardless, knowing that things could fail, knowing that a lot of things go wrong, but you really lead with, you're committed to your values as opposed to being committed to avoiding all your experiences. That is correlated with lots of constructive ways of living in one's life.
Wow. That sounds like something that a lot of people need. I mean, in fact, probably all of us need it in one corner or another of our life, where, there's something that for people who, what we traditionally call introverts, people who I know as a recovering introvert, the social situations, they have got a lot of peril in them. And, if it keeps you from participating in them, that's a huge cost, right? Whereas if you can figure out how to be robust to, saying something awkward and having to navigate out of the situation, you just have a lot more tools at your disposal.
It's funny that you called yourself a recovering introvert. I love that expression. I've written an article about how I'm a neurotic extrovert, and I wrote an article called "Confessions of a Neurotic Extrovert." And similarly, once I learned to reduce that neuroticism trait, I was able to get more out of what I really wanted. I really did want, to experience the world and have that enthusiasm aspect. And I always felt pushed and pulled by enthusiasm versus pulling away, enthusiasm pulling away. And I was like, I'm sick of that constant tension within me. Like, it's an annoying tension, right? It's like, oh, I want to go over there and talk to that person. But then it's like the neurotic part of me is like, oh my gosh, but they could reject me. And then I could this and that. And then I just like, I'm stuck like in quicksand. So that was a big part of my own personal development was reducing that neuroticism so I could be who I really wanted to be. Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing how life sometimes forces these things on you. I know that podcasting is almost the least likely thing for me to have ended up in, because I'm a perfectionist and an introvert, and looking into a camera and talking to thousands of people, and putting stuff into the world that is just off the cuff it's exactly anathema to my value system, but nonetheless, fate puts you there, I guess.
There's no way to plan it out ahead of time. You can't possibly go down all the ways that this conversation could lead and plan that out. And instead, you just have to show up and be like, hope things come to mind.
Exactly.
So true.
Exactly.
So true.
All right. We have amazingly arrived an hour and 20 minutes in. Wow. So my suggestion is that if you have final thoughts for this initial part of the conversation, we put them here, then we take a break, and we will return to use Democracy AI to find out what's on the audience's mind. So do either of you have final thoughts that belong here?
I'm good.
No, I'm pretty good. That was a really cool conversation so far.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. Those who are watching this have, I believe, a button at the bottom of their screen. They can log into Democracy AI. They can file questions that they want us to be asked, and then they can vote on which questions they think are best. And Elizabeth will be here in the second part of the conversation to navigate the interface. So, all right. Christine Brophy, Scott Barry Kaufman, it's been an excellent conversation so far. We will see you in 15 minutes.
Sounds good.
See you then.
Be well, everyone. All right, folks, we're back with the Unity Campfire with Christine Brophy and Scott Barry Kaufman. We are now going to take audience questions with the Democracy AI interface. Elizabeth is going to manage that interface for us. Welcome, Elizabeth. What do we have?
Thank you. So our first and most popular question is, a lot of the development concepts that you are discussing are things that have traditionally been nurtured by mothers. Why do we never discuss mothers leaving the home in conversations when clearly it has an impact?
Anybody like to start with that one?
What does that mean, we don't discuss mothers leaving the home? Do you guys know what that means exactly?
I have a guess.
Okay.
My guess would be that is about the fact that there was a system that successfully conveyed important lessons about the necessary skills for life, and it was disrupted by progress. And so I don't know if I'm projecting onto the question, but what I would say is that at some level, mothers moved into the workforce. Much of mothering got exported into schooling and other phenomena. And the question, I believe, is suggesting that there is some cost to that in the sense of it disrupting the natural pattern through which certain lessons would have been taken up.
Well, it's interesting though, because I mean, what you would expect if that was if that was the cause of this, because mothers, I mean, sex differences in terms of personality-based sex differences. Traditionally, you'll see women as being higher in compassion, higher in agreeableness, higher in openness, whereas with the men, you see them as being more disagreeable. They're higher in aspect intellect. But the key point there being that kind of agreeableness trait, and the compassion trait there would incline a person to not want to allow their children to fail. You want to remove their pain. You want to remove their suffering. So what you would expect is that if the cause is mothers leaving the home, that in fact children would be allowed to fail, or would be able to fail more often, and would be running around haywire and running into things, and that they would be figuring things out from a young age. And maybe it's the case that they've got too much uncertainty being bowled over on top of them at a young age, but I don't think that that's it. So I don't know if that's necessarily like the right cause effect kind of relationship to be looking at, because it wouldn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I would say I definitely think that, speaking both as a biologist and as a father, I sort of feel like, ugly as it is sometimes, the dad's traditional role is, to toughen the kid up a bit. And, I definitely personally am more likely to look at a child who's fallen off something, and rather than immediately rush to make them feel better, say, well, what'd you learn? Right. And it's not a failure of love or compassion. It is a belief that actually this is how you get strong, and that, the whole purpose of childhood is to make a functional, capable adult. And if your childhood doesn't do that because it protects you too much, it's a failure.
Yeah, it's the tension of those two traditional roles that kind of allows a kid to, you don't want to, you're not throwing a baby into the ocean and expecting it to swim. So there is a certain level of protection that they do need, so that you're scaling up the level of complexity that they have to deal with, the level of chaos that they have to deal with in a controlled way, so that they can develop that confidence. But then the traditional role for the dad is constantly testing that, like, well, maybe they'll be okay this time. Maybe yeah, they'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And it's through that tension that you kind of get the right balance traditionally.
Oh, I think this is exactly right. The scaling up of the hazard. You want them to be discovering the limits of what they actually understand, which means a certain amount of injury, because it's the injury that teaches you, that your model has failed, and it ultimately makes you safer. The last thing you want to do is, for example, teach a kid to ride a bike on the bike path and then have them commute somewhere. They'll get killed, right? You have to increase the amount of stuff that they're navigating enough that the model gets the necessary nuances built into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's why secure attachment style is conducive to a lot of positive things. If your child has anxious attachment style, it's quite likely it's because they share a lot of genes with their parents. You can thank your parents not only for the environment, but you can also thank your parents for the genes as well. And if you're an anxious child and you have the genes, your parent is an anxious parent, that's not a great combination.
Wait. I'm with you on the attachment style. I'm thrown by your suggestion that it's likely transmitted genetically. How much do we know about how heritable anxiety is? Genetically heritable.
Pretty high heritability, and that these kinds of discussions that's often not. It's saying, my mom fucked me up. What's the expression? There's like a poet, Warkin has a thing. My parents fucked me up, but we don't often talk about they also mess you up because they give you the genes as well. But there's a pretty high heritability coefficient to attachment styles, and a lot of it just comes down to the temperament. Rothbard has looked at that as well. Underlying that is kind of an anxious temperament that it's correlated with lots of other things as well.
All right, interesting. I want to
curveball.
Yeah, that is a curveball, and I'm skeptical because I know lots of claims of heritability are suspect when you actually look deeply at them. They don't necessarily mean what we think, but I don't know anything about this one, so maybe I'll dig deeper on heritability of anxiety. All right, Elizabeth, what else do we have?
Next question. So this will be our last question from this round, and then I'll ask the audience for another round of questions in just a few minutes. So this next question is, there's a great deal of research showing that high trust societies tend to have better outcomes for citizens. What is the role / interaction of personality with social trust?
I'm sure one of you is going to know a whole heck of a lot more about this than I do.
I can definitely speak to this, but I want to give Christina a chance first. If
no, you start. Go for it.
Social distrust, it definitely is it's a component of the personality structure. You find it's actually one of the facets of vulnerable narcissism is general distrust of others. But I think also probably more interestingly than that component is the environmental factors that can lead anyone to be distrustful of their environment. There's a really cool study by Daniel Nettle where he had experimenters put up posters in a really poor, dangerous neighborhood, and within 50, and he measured their pre-test general distrust personality trait, and then just even in 15 minutes in that environment. And they actually had the experiment had a van where any of the researchers could bail if they couldn't handle it, they couldn't take it anymore in that environment. They found even after 15 minutes, the levels of social distrust of the psychologists themselves, the experimenters, plummeted. Increased. The levels of increased resembling about the levels of the average inhabitant of that environment, person who have lived there their entire lives. So I think there's both a personality trait aspect of it, but there's very much a state malleable aspect to it. And if you constantly live in a environment where there's a lot of unpredictability, that's the key variable there, is the unpredictability and harshness of the environment. I think that it causes anyone to increase their general levels of distrust.
That's true. Yeah, I would say that, just in terms of the big five, for trust, the social kind of traits are conscientiousness and agreeableness, where with conscientiousness, it's kind of like you see more trust of family, trust of your community, or trust of the company, for example. So you're in group, or whoever's around you, who's working alongside of you. Whereas with agreeableness and compassion, it's kind of like a more general sort of net of trust, I would say, in the goodness of someone.
Interesting. Go ahead.
We've looked at something called the light triad, which is the opposite of the dark triad. I mentioned the dark triad earlier, but I never actually defined the dark triad, and then I was like kicking myself for that because I probably should explain what it is. It has nothing to do with the color of your skin. First of all, I want to be very clear. It's a personality structure having to do with narcissism, Machiavellianism, and like how manipulative you are and how exploitive you are, and psychopathy. But we've been try to balance out the force in the personality psychology literature. We've been studying something we call the light triad, which is humanism, faith in humanity, and Kantianism, treating people as ends in themselves, not a means to an end. And we find that general trust of your fellow human is one of the strongest loadings, in this factor analysis. We talked about factor analysis earlier of the light triad. So that there definitely is a personality variability there.
So there's a personality variability, which you would expect to track the fact that circumstances are more and less deserving of trust, and therefore it makes sense to be wired in such a way that you can upregulate and downregulate trust. But the other thing you mentioned up front makes a lot of sense too, which is if you land in some locale and the local residents are nervous and distrustful, there's every reason to think you ought to be too. Whatever they're distrustful of, you probably have more reason to be distrustful of because they at least know what they fear and you don't know what the problem is yet. So, it would make sense to have high sensitivity to that failure of trust and the ability to upregulate distrust very quickly.
That's exactly what we found. Yeah, dark triad was correlated with developmental experiences of living in an unpredictable environment. We had lots of different items for that unpredictable. It could be parents' discord, fighting with each other all the time. It could be gang violence. And we have a whole measure of this kind of thing. And the white triad was, very strongly correlated with a lack of this, a very predictable kind of upbringing. Yeah.
So I would predict that it is much easier to upregulate distrust than to downregulate it, because at the point you're distrustful, if you think about the examples would be the dog that thinks that every day it defends the homestead from the mailman, right? It's very hard for the dog to learn that the barking actually didn't do anything useful because it barks, nobody attacks, right? So it succeeded. And the cat who thinks that it's only survived this long because it hides under the bed when strangers are around, again, right? If the cat is too trusting and somebody harms it, it learns not to trust. If it isn't trusting enough, it's very hard for any lesson to tell it that because its vigilance is something that it can mistake as the reason for its persistence.
Yeah, I think that dovetails with the weather forecast theory of human development, where at a very, very early age, our brain wires itself during these critical periods to forecast what the world is like, what the rest of the world is like, and fear learning and fear unlearning are in different parts of the brain. So we actually actively have to unlearn the fear. It doesn't just happen automatically. The fear that we gained from our weather forecast systems at an early childhood about the world is not safe, the world is unpredictable, that stuff doesn't just go away. We actually have to develop strategies. That's a whole different brain system.
That's courage and the leap of faith that you need to make when your worldview gets shaken, something crazy happens, somebody gets sick, and that's completely outside of your control, and suddenly your entire world is chaotic, and you have to make a leap of faith to turn away from that uncertainty and just to make the decision that you have to just make the decision to trust again, and it's absent of reason that you have to do that.
Yep, exactly.
Because you have every reason to believe that the world is terrible and bad things are going to keep happening to you. Yeah.
All right, Elizabeth, what do we have?
Okay, so the next question brings it back to the political sphere. So, do studies exhibit a fairly even representation among the human population regarding the Big Five, and how might that affect politics? How do we get folks who would otherwise not be interested involved?
Could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, certainly. Do studies exhibit a fairly even representation among the human population regarding the big five personality traits? Mm-hmm. And how might this distribution affect politics?
Yeah, so that's yes. So that's one of the stunning findings that they come across. And I guess when you're thinking about the difference in the political systems that we have around the world, the expectation was that you would find drastically different mappings of personality in each of the different countries. And instead, what you end up finding is that we're all the same. We're all where it's all on a normal distribution, and the populations are the distribution of traits amongst the populations is the same.
Interesting. So there must be, and I know from things I've heard you say elsewhere, that there are patterns in terms of where you find people placed on which axis, even if across the population these numbers are the same, that, in terms of,
cities versus rural areas and things like that.
Cities versus rural, where on the political spectrum you are, all these things. So how much can you say about in which way these patterns are non-randomly distributed?
Well, people tend to self-sort. And I think that the traits, in a way, they make you strong in certain areas. So, for example, somebody who's higher in openness, you're less of a sense of personal boundaries. So it makes it so that when you're living on top of each other in a city, you have less of a sense that you want to have your own territory and a fence around you and your own land. So they tend to self-sort, and you'll find more liberals because of it in cities versus out in the rural areas. You'll get self-sorting of conservatives, again, on the opposite direction, where it's more important to them that they have kind of personal space and freedom to move within that, and where they are living by their rules in that area.
Yeah, my friend Jun Yun said something to me the other day about the libertarian mindset and what happens to it as you move into a city. And his point, which I thought was excellent, was that, out in a rural area, you might not have any understanding of why you would want anyone to regulate how loud you could play your radio, right? But when you're stacked on top of each other, it becomes really clear that if everybody can play it as loud as they want, anytime they want, that you're never going to get any sleep. And so the need for regulation becomes more obvious. In any case, I bet there are a lot of these where you've got two competing values in tension, and certain habitats or certain groupings reveal the value of one side or the other of the trade-off. So partly it would be a self-sorting, right? You might find conservatives moving to rural areas because they found like-minded people, and you might find that the rural areas created conservatism because the part of the trade-off that is a good match for those circumstances is conservative.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
All right. Elizabeth, do we have another question?
Yes. So I think this should be our last question. I know that we're approaching the 2-hour mark.
This is fun. I'm having too much fun here.
So this next question, are the big five personality dimensions considered to be independent of context? This person says, personally, I would consider myself very open in some contexts, but not so much in others.
So so there's a couple answers. So maybe there's two parts to this answer. We all have within us the ability to be any of the traits. So they're like you can apply them in different contexts. But the thing is that you're more likely to apply certain ones. It's like a muscle that you've really overworked or that you've flexed, and it's much easier to use that much muscle, or you're much stronger in it. So that's why, even though that people, they have potential for those different things, and that you may see them vary a little bit in context. And also, even over a day, you'll see somebody being tend to be more extroverted in the morning versus in the evening you see it kind of swoop off, or as people age you see them become lower in openness. So there is some contextual element to it, but there's also this this underlying sort of biological, I guess, element to it, kind of like a hardwiring where you tend to be stronger in some than others.
That's exactly right. This was a huge debate in like the 70s between Walter Mischel and Seymour Epstein. I mean, this was like they were really getting at it. Like Walter Mischel's like, no, there's no such thing as personality. It's all contextual. And then Seymour Epstein saying, it's really personality. But it's been reconciled that, of course, there are certain environments in particular that really throw us out of whack from what our normal tendencies tend to be, our normal action tendencies. But you could think about like reliability, or like the reliability of personality tests themselves. The more you keep adding up all the different moments of your life, you find the personality is actually pretty reliable, even if particular moments are unreliable manifestations of the overall personality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I rely on my personality, I don't know, several times a week.
Yeah.
Right. That was a terrible joke. A manifestation of my personality, I guess, for better or worse. But all right. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I want to thank you both for joining us here for it. I want to thank Elizabeth for navigating the interface with Democracy AI. And I know that I'm supposed to alert you that if you want to stick around after our discussion, there are Campfire s'mores available, both regular and gluten-free. And we will see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us on. It was really great.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was lovely.
All right. Be well, everyone.